Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Lucy in Minnesota, Lorraine in Texas, Bella in Florida, and Chaim in Florida, and Ella. Welcome, everybody. Let's get to it. Our daf today is page 62 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 4. And here we're talking about if somebody sold a piece of land, a piece of property to another, and only described it generally. So what ends up being included in the sale? We pick this up right near the top of page 62a. The Gemara continues its examination of the concept of delineating boundaries in a wide manner and considers the following case. If in the bill of sale, the seller delineated one boundary line on one side of the field as long, and the other boundary line on the other side of the field he delineated short. So Rav said the buyer, right? So we have a piece of property like this, and he basically talks about on one side this whole line. Let's say that's defined because Reuven's field, the field that abuts Reuven's field, and Reuven's field is over here. And this is the short side, right? Because he could say that, and this is Shimon's field over there. So he's got a short boundary on one side and a long boundary on the other. So what has he sold? Is he selling this rectangle right here, which has the short boundary on one side and a corresponding boundary on the other? Or is he also including this triangle above? That's what they're talking about. So in that situation, he acquires only a width of land corresponding to the short border. So he gets the rectangle, but not the triangle above. As it is assumed that the short boundary is the line that delineates the actual size of the field that was sold to the buyer, while the long boundary line was merely intended to point to the field under discussion. That is to say, the seller delineated the boundaries in a broad manner, but did not intend to include everything found within these boundaries in the sale, right? So he said, I'm selling you the field that's between Shimon and Reuven's land, right? Where all of this is Reuven, but this is Shimon. So what he really meant was this, we're not going to include all of it. Rav Kahan and Rav Asi said to Rav, but let him also acquire the triangular plot at the top, bounded by that diagonal line connecting the end of the short border to the end of the long border. The short border connecting to the long border. And Rav was silent, and he did not respond. And Rav concedes that where there is a boundary line defined by the fields of Reuven and Shimon on one side, okay, so now we're talking about something that looks like this, right? So this is Reuven's field over there, this is Shimon's field over here, this is going to be Levi's field over there, and Yehuda's field over there, right? So, and he owns this property in here, and he's got neighbors Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. So in this situation, right, so where there's a boundary line defined by the fields of Reuven and Shimon on one side, and the field being so, he's got the fields of Reuven and Shimon on one side, and a boundary line defined by the fields of Levi and Yehuda on the other side. And in the bill of sale, the seller describes the field being sold as bordered by the fields of Reuven and Shimon on one side, but mentions only the field of Levi on the other side. Right? So he mentions Reuven and Shimon and Levi in the deed of sale. So what has he sold? But he only mentions but he only mentions the field of Levi on the other side, Since had he intended to sell only the half of the field, he should have written for the buyer in the bill of sale that the field is bordered by the field of Reuben on one side, which is opposite that of Levi, on the other, or by the field of Shimon on one side, which is opposite that of Yehuda on the other, but he did not write that for him. So one can conclude from it that he is telling him that he is selling him not only the area of the fields between Reuben and Levi, right? Between Reuben and Levi. So he's selling not only this upper portion, but wait a minute. But he did not write that for him, so one can conclude from it that he is telling him that he is selling him not only the area between the fields of Reuben and Levi, but also the triangular plot bounded by the diagonal line connecting the end of Shimon's field to that of Levi. Since he mentioned the plot of land bounded by Reuben and Shimon on one side and Levi on the other, now you can also add this. And so we would assume that this is what he's telling him, the field that's bounded by Reuben and Shimon's field on one side and Levi's field on the other. He means to sell all of that. Now the Gemara continues, if the field being sold is bounded by the fields of Reuben on the east and west, and it is bounded by the fields of Shimon on the north and south. Okay. So different situation now. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So now Reuben has fields on the north and south, and Shimon has fields east and west. Okay. So what does he say? So that's the situation. So if he's got fields bounded by Reuben on the east and west and Shimon on the north and south, okay, whatever, I did reverse the you get it. So it is not enough to designate the field for the buyer as the field between the fields of Reuben and Shimon. But it is necessary to write for him in the bill of sale that the field is bounded by the fields of Reuben on two sides and it is bounded by the fields of Shimon on two sides. Otherwise, all that the buyer requires is a triangular plot bounded by one of Reuben's fields and one of Shimon's fields, right? So if he's selling a field like this and it's located between two fields of Reuben, north and south, and between two fields of Shimon, east and west, and if the seller said, I'm selling you a field that is bounded by Shimon's and Reuben's field, and that's all he said, then what would be sold is one of these triangles. In order to sell all of it, he would have to say a field that is bounded by Reuben's fields on two sides and by Shimon's fields on two sides, and then we would know that he was selling the whole thing. Obviously, same takeaway as yesterday. If you're buying a piece of land, get full description of everything that you're intending to buy. If you're selling, include a full description of everything that you are intending to sell, and don't be vague. But if people bought and sold a piece of property and they were vague, then this is how the judges are going to determine if a litigation ensues. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages. If the seller defined for the buyer only the corners of the field being sold, then what is the law? Does this mean that he is selling to him only the corners of the field, or the entire field marked by those corners? And a second dilemma was also raised. If he defined the boundaries of the field in a shape resembling the Greek letter gamma, which looks like the English letter L, right? So two sides forming a corner. Noting the boundaries on two adjacent sides that meet at a right angle. Then what is the law? Does this mean that he is selling him the entire field, or only the triangular plot marked by those boundaries and the diagonal line running from the end of one to the end of the other? And a third dilemma was also raised before the sages. If the seller defined the boundaries of the property that he is selling in an alternating fashion, mentioning only some of the fields bordering each side of the field being sold while omitting others, then what is the law? No resolution was found for these questions, and these dilemmas shall stand unresolved, meaning that if the case actually came up, we would need more information than we've already been presented with in order to make a determination. We're on page 62b, new subject. The Gemara raises another dilemma. If in the bill of sale, the seller delineated for the buyer the field's first boundary, its second boundary, and its third boundary, but he did not delineate its fourth boundary at all, right? So here we have a case like this. Let's just start over. He said, I've got a field, and he said it's bounded by Reuven's field on one side, Shimon's field on another, and Levi's field on, and Levi's field on another side. Okay, so, and this border, this boundary is not described at all in the bill of sale. Well then, what has been sold? Sounds like probably we've described a square and we don't need to fill in that top line, right? Not necessarily. So Rav says in that situation that the buyer requires the entire field except for the one furrow along which the fourth boundary runs, which is usually differentiated in some way from the field itself, right? So Rav would say, okay, he gets the whole field except for one furrow up here. And Shmuel says the buyer acquires even that furrow along the fourth boundary. And Rav Asi says he acquires only the width of one furrow along the entire perimeter. Right? So Rav says he gets, right, was Rav? Yeah, Rav says he gets all of it except for the one furrow. Shmuel says he gets that furrow as well. And Rav Asi, was it Rav Asi? And Rav Asi, whoa, look at what Rav Asi does. He says all you get is one furrow that runs along this boundary. And the rest of the field you don't get. So that's a really big difference between Rav Asi and the other two sages. Now the Gemara explains Rav Asi's opinion. He holds in accordance with the opinion of Rav, who said that by failing to delineate the fourth boundary, the seller withheld some part of the field, i.e. one furrow for himself. But Rav Asi takes this further and says that since he withheld some part of the field for himself at the fourth boundary, he withheld also some portion of the entire field. And therefore the buyer acquires only that which is adjacent to the specified boundaries. Rava said the law is that the buyer acquires the entire field except for the one furrow along which the fourth boundary runs in accordance with the opinion of Rav. And we said this only in a case where the fourth boundary is not included within the space between the two adjacent boundaries, but rather juts out beyond them. But where it is included within the space delineated by the other boundaries, the buyer acquires it as well. So now we're saying, according to Rav, when the seller delineated these three boundaries for the sale, the buyer is going to get all of it, and except for this one furrow. Now, if the one furrow is within those boundaries, so that's included too. But if the one furrow is a little bit outside those other boundaries, then he does not get that furrow. The furrow is retained by the seller. Rava adds, and even when it is not included in that space, we said that the buyer does not acquire it only in a case where there is a row of trees on it, or it is an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed. But where there is no row of trees on it, and it is not an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed, the buyer acquires it along with the rest of the field. And by inference, one derives from here that when the fourth border is included within the space delineated by the two adjacent boundaries, even if there is a row of trees on it, and it is an area fit for sowing 9 kav, nevertheless, the buyer acquires it. Now, there are those who say that Rava's ruling and the conclusion drawn from it are as follows. Rava said the law is that the buyer acquires the entire field, and he acquires even the furrow along the fourth boundary, in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. And we said this only in a case where the fourth boundary is included within the space delineated by the two adjacent boundaries, but when it is not included within those boundaries, the buyer does not acquire it. And Rava adds, and even when it is included within the adjoining boundaries, we said that the buyer acquires it only in a case where there is no row of trees on it and it is not an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed. But where there is a row of trees on it, or it is an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed, the buyer does not acquire it. And by inference, one derives from here that when the fourth boundary is not included within the two adjacent boundaries, even if there is no row of trees on it and it is not an area fit for planting 9 kav of seed, the buyer does not acquire it. Again, would have been better to specify exactly what they were buying and selling. If not, we're left to sort it out according to these competing expressions of what Rav and Shmuel said. Now, we conclude, according to both versions of the statement of Rava, that even if the seller withheld something for himself along the fourth boundary, he did not withhold anything at all in the field itself. And we also conclude, according to both versions, that where the fourth boundary is included within the space defined by the two adjacent boundaries, and there is no row of trees on it, and it is not an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed, that the buyer acquires it. And furthermore, we conclude, according to both versions, that if the fourth boundary is not included within the two adjacent boundaries, right, meaning that that last furrow is outside of these boundaries, within the two adjacent boundaries, and there is no row of trees on it, or it is an area fit for 9 kav of seed, then the buyer does not acquire it. If the fourth boundary is included within the two adjacent boundaries, and there is a row of trees on it, or it is fit for sowing 9 kav of seed, or if the fourth boundary is not included within the two adjacent boundaries, and there is no row of trees on it, nor is it fit for sowing 9 kav, the ruling in these cases was stated in this direction, that the land adjacent to the fourth boundary is acquired by the buyer, and it was stated in that direction that this land is not acquired by the buyer, depending upon which version of Rava's statement is accepted. And since there is no clear ruling in these cases, the decision is left to the discretion of the judges, who must rule in accordance with what appears to them to be the intention of the seller. Another reason that you don't just rely on general statements, because different jurisdictions might provide different answers, different interpretations of the law. Therefore, when buying and selling, be as clear as possible. New subject. Rava said, if one owns a field in partnership with another, and he says to a third person, I am selling you the half that I have in this land, so he means to sell him half of that field, i.e., his entire share as a half partner in the field. If this partner in the field says to his buyer, I am selling you half of the land that I have, so then he means to sell him 1/4 of the field, which is to say half of his share, since he only owns half of the field. Abaye said to him, what is different about this wording, that when I'm selling you the half that I have, or the half of the half that I have? What is different about this wording and what is different about that wording that you rule differently in the two cases? And Rava was silent, offering no reply. So Abaye said, I had assumed that since he was silent, he must have accepted my opinion and retracted his statement, but that is not so. As on another occasion, I saw certain bills of sale that issued from my master's house, i.e., they were issued under the auspices of my master Rava, in which it was written, the half that I have in this land, and it was clear from another clause in the bill that half of the field was being sold. And there was another bill of sale in which it was written, half of the land that I have, and it was clear from another clause in the bill that 1/4 of the field was being sold. And Rava also said, if one sold land to another and delineated boundaries on 3 sides of the field, and with regard to the 4th side, he wrote in the bill of sale, the boundary of the field is the land through which the field is halved, so he has sold him half of the field. If he writes with regard to the 4th boundary, the boundary of the field is the land from which a plot can be set apart, so he has sold him only an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed, as that is the minimum size of a plot of land defined as a field. Abaye said to him, what is different about this wording and what is different about that wording that you ruled differently in the two cases? And Rabba was silent. He did not respond. The sages understood from this silence that Abaye understood that Rabba retracted his ruling and conceded that actually in both this case and that case, the buyer acquires half of the field. But that is not so. Rav Yemar, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. But that is not so. As Rav Yemar Baal Shalema said, the matter was explained to me by Abaye as follows: whether the seller writes with regard to the fourth boundary, the boundary of the field is the land through which the field is halved, or he writes the boundary of the field is the land through which a plot can be set apart. If he said to the buyer, these are its boundaries, so he has sold him half of the field. But if he did not say to the buyer, these are its boundaries, then he has sold him only an area fit for sowing 9 kav of seed. Somewhat of a hyper-specific daf that we covered today. But again, if you're not clear in what it is you're buying and selling with great specificity, then you're going to leave it in the hands of a possible judge, a possible jury, a possible litigation. They will argue about the placement of commas and prepositions and pronouns. And you might not get what you bargained for, neither as a buyer nor as a seller. So, be specific. That's what I've got for us today. Nina's telling me no questions, so have a great night. We'll have class tomorrow, God willing, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. That's tomorrow, Wednesday. And then we will be off because I'll be out of town until the following Wednesday.